Welcome to the Secure Connections podcast, brought to you by IOTSA, the Internet of Things Security Services Association. I'm Brian Sherman, Content Director for IOTSA and host of our weekly cybersecurity discussions. My special guest today is Jason Norton, Product Marketing Director for Vipre Security, and we'll be discussing some interesting aspects of cybersecurity today. We'll keep it a little mysterious as we work into it. Welcome back to the Secure Connections podcast, Jason.
Hey, it's great to be here, Brian. Always a pleasure to talk to you. I look forward to our discussion today, and I hope that our listeners gain some value out of it.
Oh, I'm sure they will. Anytime that you're a guest, we always learn a lot of great things. So
I appreciate that.
It's always nice checking into with people in Florida when I'm up here in cold Pennsylvania still. So
that's right. And you're always, the standing invitation remains. You're always welcome to come down and visit us in Vipre Clearwater. Standing invitation.
There you go. No, our weather is like a roller coaster this week. Today's 30s, or yesterday was 30s. Today's 40s. Tomorrow's 30s, and then we get 60s and back to 30s. So it's the Erie, Pennsylvania area is always wonderful because every day you get new weather pattern. It's awesome. Never get bored. So how is life in your corner of the world?
Life is good. Yeah, you mentioned I'm down here in Florida. Of course, Vipre's in Clearwater, Florida. So we're all doing well, staying healthy and happy, luckily. And of course, it's hard to believe that we talk about 2020, and as we get into 2021, we're closing out the first quarter, and it just seems like that has flown by. So kind of remarkable that as you and I sit here, and it seems like we're kind of priming for what may come or what's to come in 2021. And well, heck, it's almost Q2. So that's the biggest surprise for me, is how time is starting to really fly by this year.
Well, I'm much happier sitting here in April of 2021 than I was in April 2020. More optimism, at least.
Yes, sir. That's for sure.
So what's, I typically see you here, you and me, back and forth between our offices, but what's one thing that you've been doing to pass the time during the pandemic?
Well, I just try to, stay involved online in terms of meetups and, communities to stay in touch. Really just try to stay connected with our partners in that way, kind of any way we can. There's probably more conversations, more outbounding to stay in touch with our partners in our MSP community. But, that's really what I've been doing, when you talk about kind of passing the time from the cybersecurity standpoint. And then, from a personal standpoint, just staying healthy and just trying to pass the time like everyone. Seems like you mentioned we're getting back to some normalcy in terms of our social, world, sports and so on. And the work life is starting to return, but I'm not sure if we could say it's returning to normal. Before we went on air, you and I talked about the condensing of office space, and we've talked before about efficiencies, and some folks may not go back to the office. And lo and behold, it looks like I'm going to be kind of one of those folks. So 2021's kind of brought some of those changes that I've talked about and I'm experiencing that I talked about last year.
Cool. Well, let's hope you've got some good security systems in place where you're at.
That's right. That's right.
That's cool.
All the best.
So, the one nice thing I've been hearing too is obviously with IOTSA will be released pretty shortly, live event in November this year. I know DattoCon is looking to push forward in October, the place to be determined very shortly. But what are some of the things you're looking forward to doing, business-wise? Are you looking forward to getting out on the road? Or are you?
Oh, yeah.
More caution?
Yeah, I can't wait to get out on the road. I know that could be an atypical response. If you would have asked, somebody that's on the road a couple of years ago, they say, "Oh man, I'd love the break." But nope, I'd like to get out. I'd like to see people. I can't wait till I'm on the floor in a pavilion and I'm at a trade show. I can't wait to be in a booth. So it's all the things that surprise folks like me are saying. But you take it away for a year or so, and you'd be surprised what you miss. So I really can't wait until all the all the big conferences start to happen again. And you touched on a couple.
Yeah, we definitely miss people. And those interactions are, it's great to do Zoom and other stuff, but the interactions aren't quite the same as when you're, able to sit down and have a meal, have a drink.
That's right.
Just sit back and relax a little bit.
That's right. The channel is about people, isn't it? And it's about the human interaction.
Yeah. Well, great. So what are some of the points IT service companies should be considering in their 2021 strategy with all the uncertainty right now?
Yeah, good question. So, of course, from my perspective, it's a security perspective. And actually, I wrote a blog recently about staying safe in 2021 and came up with kind of 5 recommendations. So I think that would still be relevant here. Well, the first recommendation I would say, and again, from my perspective, knowing the difference, is to make sure to keep your security software up to date. Surprisingly, I'm finding out that even within the Vipre ecosystem, there's some folks out there that are running legacy versions. And although we try to spread awareness and say, hey, upgrade, you need to be on the latest and greatest, oftentimes for whatever reason, those communications sometimes don't work out. And what I would say to all the MSPs and kind of service providers out there is to definitely go in and make sure that your endpoint is up to date, that you're not running a legacy version, because in and of itself, that's a security, that's a security risk. And of course, your endpoint is supposed to be doing, some of the heavy lifting in terms of protecting the network and your assets. So that's a big one. Okay, so make sure that your endpoint is up to date too. We've all heard of RDP, I think, right? And the increase in remote desktop protocol, because it's a way to communicate remotely. But with RDP comes some pretty significant security risks. Now those can be mitigated with a couple of steps. MFA, so always use multi-factor authentication, and change the listening port, of course, from 3389 to a different port. That's going to help, hide the traffic, but that in and of itself won't solve for RDP hacks altogether. Keeping up with Patch Tuesdays from Microsoft helps. And then finally, in terms of RDP, to enable network level authentication, right, at the network level. The third would be third-party patching. Number 3, third-party patching, easy to remember, right? But third-party patching is the similar idea to Patch Tuesday, except it's for all the third-party software programs, the popular ones, Brian, like Adobe and Java, web browsers, right? And for over a decade, this is a regimen that security admins have been in, but for whatever reason, sometimes those third-party patches get away from us. Right. And their statistics, dark reading comes to mind. They said 8 out of 10 of the most exploited vulnerabilities in 2019 impacted Microsoft products. So they came from unpatched systems, and the problem was, to make it worse, the patch was available, so it just wasn't applied. And then 4 and 5. 4 would be the principle of least privilege, and of course that's a rule set that talks about the minimum level of access necessary, or the minimum level of permissions necessary to perform, your necessary, a set of necessary job functions. And by restricting the wider access to the valuable data, the most high value machines and data, it's a protective mechanism, right, Brian? That's going to make sure that the credential theft that could occur is mitigated.
That's one of the ones I hear from MSPs that requires the most collaboration with their clients and communication, because everybody wants full access, and trying to explain why they don't need it or shouldn't have it. I would say that's one of the toughest discussions that MSPs have with their clients on why they lock down certain things. And you could probably teach a class on that. You've probably done that a lot over the years, but yeah, it's a
biggie, isn't it? It's a biggie. Forbes had an article that had a kind of a attention-grabbing headline that said a dark web audit revealed 15 billion stolen logins from over 100,000 breaches. And those are credentials. Those are the keys of the kingdom. It's especially concerning for MSPs because of the lateral movement that occurs. And we'll talk about that later when we get into the kind of pattern of a particular malware that we're going to talk about. But that east-west lateral movement that can be really destructive, since MSPs obviously have the large client base. But we'll get into that. And then just to round this out so we can keep moving, the number 5 is to have an incident response plan. Obviously, you don't want to kind of change the tires as the bus is moving, so to speak. Have an incident response plan, test the incident response plan, and there's a lot of resources to do so. Start with NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology. I'll also be touching on NIST and CISA a little bit later, but the incident response plan, you don't have to even really create yourself per se anymore, because the best practices are really kind of out there and can be adhered to by looking at the NIST cybersecurity framework.
Now, Jason, in your experience, are you finding a lot of partners had to change those up over the last year with all of the workplace shifts, including like yours? Instead of being in office now, work from home, hybrid workplace.
Well, that's a really good point. How the environment over the past 18 months, say, has shifted the incident response plan, where you go from a lot of primarily internal assets, right? So the notion of IT managed devices, and all of a sudden you have the notion of a lot of unprotected devices, and that does create a big risk. And as we get into this, not surprisingly, this all is going to funnel back to, by and large, it's email, the email security and the email attack vector as we roll this out. So, with an incident response plan and folks being largely dispersed and offsite, emails even continue to play a large part in communicating just carte blanche. Whether it's the same kind of method of communication you're going to have to rely on for an incident response plan that may have got you in trouble in the first place. And there's a bit of a dichotomy there, unfortunately.
Yeah, good news is we have many platforms for communicating these days. You may just have to shift up the plan a bit.
And from a revenue perspective, 2021, we're touching on the aspects so you've alluded to. So it makes sense that a business VPN, or we touched on email security with advanced threat protection, or mobility. Those are all services to explore if our listeners aren't exploring those yet. And then with the efficiencies that everybody's looking for in 2021, we'll continue on the Vipre end to talk about, again, from our perspective, limited sourcing and kind of evangelizing how MSPs and bars can really look around and enjoy limited sourcing. And if it's not from Vipre, it can be from someone else, but to try to get 2 or 3 or 4 critical components from a single vendor for all the efficiencies therein, like support, bargaining power, similar UI, UX, one throat to choke, all that. And there's just no reason to have 3 or 4 different security vendors to solve for the componentry, or at least I haven't heard that objection yet. The closest you'll get to that objection, usually from MSPs, is, now wait a second, if we take this to the nth degree, I may not want all of my eggs in one security basket. And that's where we would sometimes talk about a perspective where your true backup and disaster recovery, you might look at a different platform for that. But all of your security, when you talk about endpoint and data protection and people protection and security awareness, all that, you can typically find all that these days under one vendor. Right.
Well, to your earlier point is, we're in Q2 now.
Yep.
It seems like Q1 flew by, which I guess is a good thing when everybody's isolated. But there's been, if anything, categorize the first quarter as a flood of ransomware and cybersecurity attacks on high-profile institutions. And many experts are saying that trend may continue. How can MSPs get a handle on these pervasive security risks before it impacts them or their clients? And I focus on both of them too, because MSPs are obviously still in the crosshairs, and their clients are obviously, the focal point for most IT service companies.
Right.
Or are we already beyond that point?
Right. Or is it too late? At least for the MSPs that Vipre partners with, it's not too late, so to speak, because we work with MSPs that work with SMBs. And so when we talk about Main Street USA, it's not too late. We're still in good time to evangelize and to lock down these security stacks. But for some larger MSPs and certainly MSSPs, they've already experienced some of these high profile exposures. So in a sense, maybe it's too late for them, although I'm sure, boy, this is easy for me to say, but I'm sure they're better off for it in a way that they're more secure now than they were before. And again, that's very easy for me to say, and I don't say that lightly. But you're right. We've already seen several high-profile attacks in 2021, and of course there were several last year. So I don't expect that's going to be a trend that ebbs at all.
Yeah. No, I see your point though. Is they may not feel they're better off when they're undergoing an attack or remediating all of the issues. But I've talked to a couple that have gone through, the breaching experience from within their own MSP, and afterwards are like quite the evangelist is going through and saying, "Here's how to avoid this." And yeah, now the great news is we've got all these fantastic systems in place and are more confident going back out and gaining new clients. So in
That's
both
right.
cases,
Great point.
In both cases, the great part is they had huge networks of other MSPs and peers that helped them quickly resolve the problems and then address it and move forward. And neither lost a client intentionally, other than I think the one had a client that was leaving at that point. But so ransomware, it seems to be getting worse, not better. Yet we've been talking about it for literally years.
Right.
With all the technology and information that's available, why do these attacks continue? Do you think we'll ever get a handle on it?
That's a good question. I think that's at the crux of our discussion in a way. Gee whiz, we've been talking about this for 24 months, at least, a serious ransomware for 24 months. But the headlines that I read keep getting worse, more bombastic. The ransoms are going up. The threats are more pervasive, more sophisticated. And so, when we talk about have cyber criminals gotten that good, or, are we just not, as an industry, listening to the best practices? I think it could be a little of both, and I'll explain what I mean. So, at the top levels of cybercrime, there's no doubt that the techniques have gotten better and the methods have gotten better at the top levels, no doubt. Think of like state-sponsored malware campaigns that we hear about from Russia, North Korea, and China. And those are the groups that are writing the sophisticated state-sponsored malware attacks. These are folks that have to work in malware farms in North Korea, stuff that we wouldn't believe. They go to work like a factory, except when they sit down, it's to hack against our government and our private enterprise. And it's for the purpose of big-time ransom operations, like the Doppelpaymer gang that we'll talk about. They hit Kia, just one example, for 20 million, Kia Motors. And stealing trade secrets is a big problem as well. And then planting spyware in our computer infrastructure is a big problem. So that's at the state level, right? That's at kind of the highest level where you get what's called these zero-day threats, zero-hour threats, really sophisticated stuff that takes money and backing and skills to write the codes. They're not buying this off the shelf. They're the ones that are putting it on the shelf to be bought. And that brings me to my second point, Brian. So there's a trickle-down effect. And, will these big state-sponsored actors probably, perpetrate a ransomware attack against the average SMB with 10 employees? Probably not. But that trickle-down effect means that same piece of sophisticated technology or malware, I should say, trickles down to market, goes on the dark web, and is often available now as ransomware as a service. And this is the notion of franchising. And it's also satisfies the wallet and the ego, because now I have notoriety as a malware author, and I'm franchising my malware as a service. And if it's effective malware, it probably is a derivative of some heavy duty code that rolled down from the highest levels. So it's a trickle down effect, and it's a little bit of both. The cyber criminals have gotten that good. Even to a smaller degree, forget about speeds and feeds, dots and dashes. The phishing campaigns have gotten more sophisticated. And we all know that the Prince of Nigeria scam isn't going to fool anybody anymore, but certainly
I don't know. There's
and maybe it will, but certainly a spoofed supply chain invoice has a pretty good chance. So, there's some real threats that are trickling down, Brian.
I always wonder if now we've got all of these people that are very proud of the malware they've created and stuff. Maybe we need to do a large award show just so that everybody would show up. Kind of like the cops do when they try to do these big drug bust things. Is Maybe they'll show up to accept their reward, and then they can just take it.
Well, I think that you just let the cat out of the bag. I can just see it now. The dark webbies, and the inaugural award show. It'll take place on the dark web, and they'll give out awards to each other.
Yeah,
I see that happening.
we'll just pin down. We'll send Jack Bauer in. He'll find them, take them out.
Get them all in one place.
Yeah. I think we'll have to think that through next time.
Let's put a pin in that. You're onto something.
There we go. So, obviously you mentioned some of the things in ransomware. Doppelpaymer, Clop, Revel, Babook Locker is one of my favorite new names too. I don't know where they get these names from. Maybe you can go into that, but the number of ransomware variants and attack methodologies is really exploding right now. Well, let's talk about those attack vectors. Do they each enter organizations the same way? Can you give us a little rundown of how that happens?
Yeah, well, and you're right. The bad guys never leave you wanting when it comes to what they name their stuff, right? Clop, Doppelpaymer, some interesting terms there.
Waiting for the Death Star. If I see the Death Star one, I am just logging off the internet.
That's right, because we all know what's to come. It's not going to be good if you have the Death Star. Again, you're giving away some of the best stuff here. For the the black hats that maybe tuned it in. But listen, that's so funny. But so in terms of attack vectors, it typically comes in through email, and I know everyone is sick to death of hearing that, but I can't make it not be true. And if you take Doppelpaymer, this is a sophisticated piece of ransomware. And it starts as a simple spam attack. So that's email. And it's the most general kind of email. It's spam. But it goes through several incarnations in its life cycle. All right. So I guess imagine, if you will, the kind of life cycle and some of these variants that you've heard of, right? So for example, when the malware arrives via the spam campaign, emotet binary is used to download what's called Dridex. Dridex actually downloads the ransomware tools, and it opens up affected systems for the incoming connections for the command and control servers. And now we've had emotet and Dridex so far. And after it has the CNC servers, as our MSPs know, that's when they become most affected. And we've heard of the variants or the malware called PowerShell Empire, Cobalt Strike. We've all heard of Mimikatz. That's what enables that lateral movement. That's what disables the MSP's endpoint software, and that's what executes and becomes Doppelpaymer, right, with the correct parameters. And then the Doppelpaymer actually is what encrypts, locks out the users, and we kind of know the rest. But what's interesting about that, just to take a step back, is I mentioned 4 household names to security administrators: Emotet, Dridex, Cobalt Strike, and now Doppelpaymer. And we've brought it all back to the email attack vector. So it really does remind us that email is critical to protect, and email security is arguably more important than endpoint. What I mean by that is, if you think back when we were all under the same roof, the kind of by and large it was easier for IT because they had the managed devices. It was easier for the MSPs to take care of folks that were managed. But when folks start to leave the network and be dispersed all over the place, they're going to probably skip the perimeter defenses, the stuff like the hardware firewall, and they're going to miss the technologies like DNS protection that's so critical, and content filtering, because they're going to skip the perimeter, and they're going to skip the endpoint as well. So they're not going to be covered for like DLP or any of the advanced protection and heuristics. So that's why it's so critical to at least get that level of mail flow in external unprotected devices, so that at least intersects in the email. Does that make sense? So because unprotected device that's not running email security is going to whiz right past your email protection. It's going to whiz right past your perimeter protection. It's going to whiz right past your endpoint, and it's going to be right into the gold nuggets. Where at least if you provide email security when the unprotected external devices whiz past the perimeter and the endpoint, they've been critically caught by the mail flow.
Right. I always look at it when I go down to pick up my daughter from college in southern Pennsylvania. I go by Fort Letterkenny, and I use this for an example because Fort Letterkenny has big fence all the way around it, but when you go down the one side, there's a large creek, and you can put the fence very easily over land, but when it gets to the creek, that's got to flow. And it's quite interesting because you know that it's like all of a sudden you just see a spot where water flows under. You're like, anybody can get in there, but it makes you wonder what layers of protection they have, cameras, I'm sure there's like 10 different
Oh
security
yeah.
things on that crick because you can't stop the normal flow. It's like email. You can't stop that flow. So you got to put extra protections in place because that's the only way that it can get in and out without a door. So I don't know. That's just my fun analogy whenever I
Hey,
hear
it still works. I mean, I'm sitting here and it lands. The castle in the moat or
it.
the
Yeah.
house for the security analogy, it still works.
Yeah, because you have to describe this to clients. I know with MSPs, a lot of times we talk about, hey, you can't stop email, but we need to put some protections in place because it's the worst. It's the easiest way for anybody to get in. So let's, one thing I want to ask you too is what's the role of an exploit kit in this process? Because I know we talked a little bit
Hear a
about
lot
it, you
about
hit
it.
on it,
Yeah.
but explain that for me, would you?
Sure. So, well, exploit kits are just that they're kits that are, hate to define it with its own self, but take, for example, Microsoft Office 365.
Mhm.
It's known that that is the largest mailman, so to speak. There's two mailmen by and large, and Microsoft and Google are it. But the mailman isn't the watchdog, so to speak. So they're only delivering the mail. The big mistake is to think that they're also providing the watchdog, that they're also security. And they're not. So criminals know this. It's a numbers game. It's a one-to-many game. That's why spam is so attractive. But there's exploit kits that are written for Office 365. That's the best example I could give because it's known that if I create an exploit kit that preys on those vulnerabilities that the black hats have already researched and communicated, then they have a higher chance of success. And so when you take a step back and you look at a classic ransomware scenario, the exploit kit typically happens in like step 2. So phase 1 is actually the initial email. So the initial email is received by the end user. It's usually an attachment or a link, and that contains, or rather that goes back to the command and control servers that I mentioned. That's when the exploit's pulled down by the workstation. And that's when the nastiness happens. So the exploit kit does most of the damage, Brian. Like I said, it gets pulled down. And the interesting thing about exploit kits is that they can determine what the best exploit kit is because the kit downloads its exploit database as it catalogs that machine. So that given machine that I talked about in step 1. And imagine it going through, like initializing, and it's just picking the best exploit kit. And then it selects the exploit kit, executes and primes the system for infection. And that includes gaining those admin rights that we talked about and credentials. And then that's when it harmfully removes all the backup and disaster recovery in the exploit kit phase 2. So the exploit phase is the nasty phase. And then phase 3 is infiltration. And that, kind of the rest is history. But that's what's so interesting about exploit kits is that they help to deliver that sophisticated punch because it catalogs the machine that gets infected and it's able to map out accordingly the best exploit kit to download.
So while MSPs are doing their security assessments, the exploit kits are doing the same thing, but for nefarious reasons.
That's right. Good way to put it.
Good. So, as if ransomware is not enough, there's always that, I always think of the commercials, but yet there's more.
Yeah, wait, there's more.
But wait, there's more. Yeah. So cyber criminals, I know, are using the new tactic, double extortion. So as if single wasn't bad enough, can you explain this methodology? Tell us a little about what
Sure.
that means for
Sure.
MSP
And you're right.
and their clients.
Insult to injury, or it could be injury to financial insult, but it's double extortion is actually just like it sounds. So not only is there the encryption component, right, to the attack, so the classic ransomware for Bitcoin, but if companies refuse to pay, the idea of double extortion is the bad guys will threaten to leak either proprietary or sometimes embarrassing. I think Ashley Madison hacked a couple of years ago, information online. So the Ashley Madison thing is maybe far-fetched, but it's more about the proprietary information. So the takeaway is it's gone from just an encryption to data exfiltration to say, I'm going to encrypt it, sure, and I'm going to get you that way. But if you refuse to pay, okay, I'm going to, then I'm just going to start to leak this stuff until you think twice and decide to pay me. So that's the classic double extortion. But when I said that you could possibly have injury to financial insult, I think we've crossed a threshold when you take the doppelpaymer gang. People are like, huh? Why are you calling it? Why is the ransomware called gang? Well, the ransomware is doppelpaymer, but the doppelpaymer gang is a gang of thugs. And in this particular organization, they've threatened physical violence in some cases when victims have refused to pay. And that's totally reminiscent of the mob, right? You're gonna get kneecapped if you refuse to pay. And this stuff sounds far-fetched, but then you start to consider the social reconnaissance that can occur from executives and companies via social media, via whaling, via phishing campaigns and things of that nature. Brian, is it that far-fetched that you could pick a company and pull a double extortion, and if they don't pay, to threaten an executive? Probably not that difficult, unfortunately.
Well, if you've ever read anything on like the fall of the Soviet Union and Russia, and you realize why a lot of these gangs are coming out of Russia these days, it's easy to imagine that, because there's a reason why so many government officials are billionaires.
Oh yeah,
right now.
Oh,
yeah,
Mm-hmm.
It's scary, but are there any unique steps that MSPs need to take to counter things like these double extortion attacks, or is it just do the normal to prevent?
It is due to normal. I guess don't get caught up in the noise, because that is some of the sensationalism that you and I touched on at the beginning, where this has kind of taken that turn towards sensationalism. But it's just that the double extortion is noise. You just need to still lock down, still use a layered security approach.
Yeah, it just shows another level of what they could where they could take this. Yeah, but if you're doing the right things, hopefully not making your clients the low hanging fruit anyway.
And I should say that really helpful would be for MSPs to look at supplementing, for example, there's Outlook add-ins that can prevent data leakage and misaddressed emails, things of that nature. And there's a few companies that come to mind that do that, including Vipre, but not just Vipre. But I mean, that keeps the data integrity there, because you can make it look for key numbers, key patterns, things like that. It's going to throw up big warnings. So when we talk about email security, it kind of runs the gamut. It's not just putting up the wall for spam, and it's not just having the ability to take links, sandbox them, or take attachments and sandbox them and see what it's going to do. A lot of times it's these measures that are people-oriented. Think of security awareness training. That's almost should be thought about by MSPs as an email delivery service, as an extension of email, because that's what the training is. It's how not to get taken by all the email attack vector scams.
Trust no one. Trust nothing.
And unfortunately.
Yeah, that's the hard part too, because
we're trusting individuals, right?
Yeah, sometimes you have to trust things, and people make mistakes. It's going to happen, especially as good as some of these attacks are getting. It's tricky. So I could stand here all day, always with you, Jason.
Yeah, same.
Discussion, but do you have any final thoughts before we sign off today?
Boy, I guess we're out of time, like you said already. Well, final thoughts. It's going to be another roller coaster year, I think, in terms of, there's no doubt that the malware and the ransomware will continue to challenge our MSPs, but there's also money to be made from these kind of same maladies. And one example would be, when I think about a standard security practice, firewall, endpoint, email, and user and data protection. Standard practice, meaning we haven't gone into threat hunting, we're not in a SOC, we're not doing anything advanced yet. I can think of 10 billable services as an MSP that would come just from the basic security practice. We know that there's spend. We know that there's the extra budget dollars that do exist in the SMB are going towards security. This message is getting out there, and I hope that the MSPs would agree with that. So, go forth and conquer. It's going to be challenging, but at the same time, there's money to be made. Just I can't put it any other way. And then in terms of staying, up to date and keeping your house tight, I can't stress enough to keep up to date with CISA, that's the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Agency, and NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology. This isn't hyperbole. There's actual blueprints and best practices of how to set up layered security, how to set up email security in terms of best practices. So I can't stress enough to use those free resources that the government provides.
Fantastic. And you gave us a good teaser there too. I want to know those 10 security things next time when you come back.
Sounds good.
Yeah, you dropped that on us right at the end. So that's great. So on behalf of IOTA, I'd like to thank Jason Norton. I can't talk today either.
Hey, Norton.
Yeah. Hey, Norton, we've got you. From Vipre Security for joining us today. Before we sign off, I do ask you to take a moment, check out our innovative new website with a wealth of cybersecurity resources created specifically for, guess what, MSPs and MSSPs. Give it a test drive at iota.com. Thank you again for joining us today, and have a safe and secure day.